Australia's first convicts landed at Botany Bay in 1788. Some escaped their jailers and went on the run. During the next 80 years, 157,000 convicts were shipped from England to build a nation. It's only just over a century ago that the last convict transport landed, and today 500,000 of the 13 million Australians can claim convict ancestry should they wish to.
He is sentenced to receive 50 lashes, 10 lashes daily at this hour, until punishment prescribed by the court is justly and so served.
In those intolerant days, convicts were treated with more brutality than understanding. But whatever the crimes for which they suffered, they begot some marvellous cricketers.
4, 5.
Farewell to old England, poor young girl. Farewell to me, Rumples as well. Farewell to the round old lady, where I once used to cause such a smell. Sing it to a liar, sing it to a liar,
Members of a society called the First Fleeters boast of convict in their family trees, just as Americans brandish a Mayflower heritage. Though they do have a tendency to admit their ancestor was punished not, perished at thought, for murder or rape, but for some more acceptable offence like stealing a potato, or at worst, half a loaf. So Australia was born in a divided world of convicts and warders, when free men had sympathy or protection for the most brutal escaping prisoners. And today that Botany Bay tradition persists. The easygoing Australian remains hostile to authority in all its forms, and the Sydney police are as unpopular as any force in the world.
The end of round 5. Joshua is down, but he's not out.
The amiable Aussie, who accepts strangers at their face value, is still more likely than anyone else in the world to shrug and accept a criminal, especially if he likes beer and plays cricket. So if you're on the run, this is the place to be. And tonight let's consider two crimes. One, the most publicised robbery of the century, the other as rewarding but almost unknown. Both criminals reached Australia to find tolerance and a sort of understanding. The last convict ship sailed in 1868 and landed here at the Rocks, Sydney's old dockland thieves' kitchen, keeper of its secrets and its colonial house museum, Mrs. Shirley Ball. The attitude towards the convicts seems sort of curiously ambivalent, because the First Fleeters are very proud, the society which claims total convict ancestry. They're very proud of their convict ancestors, and yet at the same time they seem to be a bit sheepish about them today.
Well, I think, anybody that's the first in anything is proud of it. If you're the first rapist in the world, I suppose you'd be a bit proud of being the first, but I know in my family I've sort of gone to social gatherings and met relatives and sort of started reeling off our convict ancestry, and the faces go stiff and the eyes go glazed and they don't want to know me or anything about it.
Of course, women convicts must have been at a premium then. They were highly prized, were they not?
Oh yes, I'd like to think that we were as prized as highly now. When the women came over, they were taken up to the women's factory at Parramatta. And these women ranged from 14 to 57. So what happened was that the convicts and other men that wanted to have wives, they'd go up and sort of inspect them and so forth and pick the wife. And what usually happened was the ugly, I suppose, the infirm and the too old, they were sort of left there, and they generally became known as nurses. But I think that a lot of them were there too, and they supplied sort of temporary comfort to the convicts. But then, because there was this terrible shortage of women, and a lot of people mightn't like to think of it, homosexuality was terribly rife here in the early days. Convicts in the barracks and so forth, some of them were never known by anybody, any other name but a woman's name, Heather and Priscilla and so forth, and wore women's clothing.
There does persist the attitude of the of the convict to the warder. One does detect that towards the police here.
Oh yes, we're very anti-authority, but I think in those days they were anti-authority, they had to give in to it, but authority that was abused or misused. I mean, we have our folk hero Ned Kelly and the bushrangers and so forth. The only thing I think since then that has captured people's imagination here, that, you know, there's almost an undercurrent of admiration and affection, is Biggs.
Do you think this is our haven for international criminals? Do you think they regard Australia as a place where they're going to be treated more gently and accepted?
Well, probably not by authority, but I truly do think, and Biggs got away with it. It was proven that there were quite a lot of people here in Australia knew who he was, and nobody told on him. So I think they would get a haven among a lot of average people. The authorities would probably jump straight down on them, but I think they'd get a lot of help.
Lost in the helpful Sydney crowd, Bob Bowden, a quiet, rather pixelated man of 56 with wild hair and eyebrows. He ran away from home and his academic Ohio family at the age of 15, and since then's enjoyed an almost unbroken record of fame, with one startling exception. He's one of the world's most successful forgers. Starting with his school report, progressing to wartime ration books, he'd worked his way up the counterfeit scale to forging $2.5 million worth of near-perfect notes, and to a most unusual act. The United States Treasury agent called him a one-man threat to the American economy. After serving 8 months in a Californian penitentiary for forging petro coupons, he'd sought refuge in Australia and was trying to set up shop as an aerial photographer, though suffering the financial discouragement we all know only too well.
It was quite obvious that by working and saving, well, I'd get the old age pension before I ever saved enough. So the idea occurred that, having done one bit of forgery, well, why not progress to something a little bit more ambitious?
$2.5 million, it's £1 million to me, more than £1 million to me. It'd be a hell of a business to require £1 million.
Yes, you have it there, you're actually hoping to get a couple of 100,000 out of it. However, when you have the machine running and everything is set up, it is quite a temptation to put a little more paper in and just watch it run through. Yes, well, why not? Sure, I'll feed a few more reams to this. Everything is going well.
So, trying to put something by for a rainy day, he set up a printing press in this Balmain bungalow, and in 3 months turned out fake dollars worth, in today's devalued sterling, £1,700,000.
Well, actually, in photographing, you just paste it down using rubber cement flat. In fact, this enlarger would be quite capable of doing it.
Yes.
Use the type of film you use being orthochromatic. In fact, with a light slide there, you could even do it there for your original shot.
Yes.
So that gives you the negative with which you start.
Right.
Well, of course, the next thing you must do then is make a giant paper enlargement, about 5 feet long.
5 feet?
Yes, because what you're going to do is rebuild the thing. So you're going to reconstruct the whole lot. You're actually not going to use one bit of their work. You're putting a tracing material over this 5-foot enlargement, and you're reconstructing it, getting rid of all the dirt damage, mechanical damage incurred in their printing.
Now, what about the paper? Yeah. Because, I mean, that always sounds good to me.
Yeah. Well, of course, the thing is, with the paper, very important is the correct thickness. Any good bond paper of about 4,000th thickness with a high rag content will do the job. Once everything is set up, you just stand there and more or less monitor it.
Now, weren't you worried about your curious Australian neighbours saying, what's going on?
No, well, what you use the radio turned up to a reasonable volume, not so loud as to annoy the neighbours, but possibly the volume that a person slightly hard of hearing might use.
And what about your wife? Didn't she say what's going on?
I gave her a bit of a cock and bull story. I explained the machine as an acquisition for the purpose of producing a bit of pornography.
But even so, when they come out, they're virgin. I suppose you couldn't pass a note in that condition.
I'll put it this way, it would look too much as if it came straight from the bank, and of course, if people are counterfeit conscious at all, they're going to think, new note.
So how do you age them?
Well, I found that the best way, and a lot of experimenting, was a mixture of glycerine and water, initially I tried doing some in a bucket by hand, just putting them down and wringing the things as the same way you'd wash a bunch of dirty socks.
Yes.
You know, just give them hell.
Yeah.
That worked very well, but the only thing is you couldn't accommodate very many.
And you get dishpan hands, or
Oh yeah.
wash a woman's fingers.
You just beat the hell out of them that way. Well, finally I thought that it did work out that I was using an old-fashioned plunger-type washing machine. And you just make a couple of buckets full of solution, put them in there, and just let that plunger action beat hell out of them. And just every now and then stop and shift them around, and so that they're getting crushed and crumbled. And well, by the time they come out, they look like notes that they could have been anywhere. They could have been in a seaman's shoe when he sneaked ashore. They could have been any place. Dirty, worn notes.
So you forged $2.5 million, but of course it's still only paper, however
That's right.
beautifully printed.
Yes, of course.
What did you then have to do?
Well, then you've got to think of a way of how to get rid of it. Now, there's really two ways. You can either wholesale it to people, if you can find the right people. Now, at whatever price, you can get 10, 15% to someone who'll take $100,000, and then they're going to get rid of it, obviously, at face value or whatever they get. They're taking a chance, and of course, they're getting the greatest reward for it. It's either that way or passing it yourself. I passed quite a bit myself because at $50 a time, I found that if you make a purchase of somewhere around the $10 mark, you've got a $40 profit. In the course of a day, you can get through an awful lot of 50s.
And you get an awful lot of $10 things you don't want.
Oh, you throw those away. Look, you just drop them, cheap watches and things like that. You finish up, leaving them in washrooms, handing them to bums on the street if one of them approaches you or anything like that. So, $150, one $10 watch, $9.95. You may throw it into the first toilet. Doesn't matter what you do with it. You got your $40.
And how many times would you do this in a day?
Well, you just go as fast as you can. You just go for the look of your life. If you can get it down to, say, a transaction in 4 minutes, you do it. So I think the method that I was using for distribution was good because I was avoiding the place where the authorities, if they were looking for counterfeit, would be looking. Race courses, gambling joints, and that sort of thing. See, those are the places that most people who were trying to get rid of a lot of fake money would automatically think of. They'd say, oh, go to the races, unload a bundle. Well, of course, race courses are always infested with detectives for any number of reasons. So I did a run through, visited a number of U.S. cities on shopping expeditions.
Well, just buying these little bits and pieces
Yeah.
again? Mm-hmm. Sounds like a hell of a lot of work for not too much profit, doesn't it?
Well, it isn't because...
But you're on tenterhooks all the time because you think somebody's going to grab you, don't you?
Well, you're working under strain. But there again, it's a matter of you have to try to develop some faith in your product. And, if you ever feel that you're beginning to weaken a little bit, well, just look at a genuine 50 note, look at one of your own and say to yourself, well, can I see any difference? I couldn't. I tried a number of times. So I don't see a difference. How are these shop people going to?
There's no doubt that people try to hold up banks at enormous risk
Yes.
to themselves to get just a fraction of what you earned in the comfort of your own home.
Well, these are a different type of people altogether. See, the man that holds up a bank is the one that's desperate.
Whereas you...
Well, I put a lot of thought. You put a lot of thought into this type of project, and you try to, sum up your chances of getting away with it. Decide, well, it is an acceptable risk or it isn't. Whereas a bank robbery obviously is not an acceptable risk, not to me.
So at the end of this spin across the United States, what had you got to show for it in real money?
A good many thousands.
And what did you do there, and what happened?
Well, I had this airplane that I had organized the purchase of in England, and I was going to fly it out to Australia with a stop at Singapore to work an operation there. But then coming into Singapore, I finished up pranging the airplane. I had to ditch it in the Strait of Johor at nighttime, and its doors were loaded with fake money, which fortunately for me never got found.
But of course, at a time when you were liable to lose your own life, I suppose the loss of the money wasn't too important.
80,000 in fake money was of no value whatsoever. I was quite busy trying to think of how am I going to land an airplane in the dark on water fixed undercarriage, it's going to ditch badly. I won't be able to see where the water is. I won't be able to flare out and lose a bit of speed, and I've got to try to keep the wings straight. And I was very busy with other things. Money was the last of the least interest at that time.
You see, you're such a gentle and agreeable man that it's easy to forget that you committed what society regards as a most reprehensible crime. And I found myself laughing when I'm talking to you, but I suppose I ought to be indignant about it, didn't I?
Well, I don't know. There again, actually, there's one to look at it this way. All I suppose I really was doing was making a very minute contribution to slightly watering down the total note issue of a major country. Now, however many hundreds of billions of dollars that note issue may be, my puny little 2 million, it'd be like an extra drop of water in the ocean. I'll put it this way: I find it when I read the newspapers and hear about people kicked to death for fun, that sort of thing, and then they catch these young louts and they give them 2 years in jail. I think, my God, what have I done wrong?
One thing he'd done wrong in this crime without a victim, as he calls it, was to leave a stack of his rejected first-run notes buried beneath a Confederate's house. 10 years later, they were dug up and used, and the police traced them back to Boda. By then, the American statute of limitations had run out, so he could only be charged, in Australia, with possession of counterfeiting equipment. But he was so indignant at this tardy accusation of a crime he'd almost forgotten about that he took a small plane over Sydney Harbour and radioed the police commissioner that unless given a free pardon, he'd fly out to sea and crash. For 5 hours, he buzzed Sydney. Today, this crazed pilot repeats the flight pattern that frightened the city.
What happened?
Well, of course, in the process, there were numerous radio communications. I gave the terms under which I would return and land, those terms being that they dropped the charges against me and either permit me to carry on my normal business or I would be willing to leave the country after, allowing me time to close down.
Now, you felt hard done by.
Well, I looked at it this way. For a number of years, I'd been running a legitimate business, carrying out aerial photography for such as the government, various private companies, etc. And what useful purpose does my destruction serve? I had spent a couple of months at the penal institution Long Bay on remand, and I realized that it would be a case of die out there by inches or go out and get it over with quickly. So I thought, well, hell, I'll do it. Either they're going to give me what I want or I'm finished anyway. I had nothing to lose. So after these many hours, when of course my fuel was becoming rather critical, they did inform me that the Commissioner of Police had acceded to my requests and that I could land with immunity. So, well, by that time I was so low in fuel that I was tracked back to Bankstown. I was almost looking at tennis courts and thinking, well, do I know how to land an airplane in a tennis court?
Now, you could have got life.
I could have got life.
What did the prosecutor ask for?
Well, he wanted me to do it, to have to serve at least 8 years.
8 years.
That was the minimum he was willing to settle for.
And what did you get?
I got 5 years with a 12-month non-parole period, which meant that I'd be guaranteeing automatic release at the end of 12 months.
So this flight, when you terrorized the city, yes, it paid off.
Well, it saved me 7 years at least.
Doing his time in jail, Baudin was put to work, would you believe, in the prison printing shop. On release after a year, he resumed his aerial photography, working for the Australian government and taking pictures of the Queen when she opened that opera house.
Is that because the police are less efficient, the people are less vigilant, more easygoing?
Well, I'd say it's largely the public attitude. The Australians are rather friendly and easygoing people. They're not noted for the love of authority, which of course has a lot to do with the national origin. And the general attitude is that If somebody's done something, as long as it isn't vicious, well, so what? If it's only a slap against authority, people are inclined to take that attitude.
It's still the convicts and warders' attitude, you find?
A little bit, yes. Well, I found, for example, that the government, which was employing me in aerial photography, such as the Public Works Department, State Planning Authority, the type of organization that in most countries would be ultra-conservative. Well, here I got into the trouble, did my time, came out and went straight back to work for them.
For the government?
Yes, because they were paying me for work and I had been delivering. And their attitude was, well, if this fellow can deliver, to hell with what he's done, he's giving us what we want.
Another man who just about got away with it and is still free is the great train robber Ronald Biggs. Mrs. Biggs, or Charmian Brent as she's known here, followed him to Australia at the end of his first escape route. Now I've come to her bungalow home in this Melbourne suburb to learn the other side of the great train robbery. Charmian was the 18-year-old daughter of a Reigate schoolmaster when she met and married a small-time crook known as Syrup. That was Ronald Biggs. One day in 1963, Biggs went looking for a loan of £400 to buy their home in Red Hill, Surrey, and found himself part of a gang which stole $2.5 million.
Of course, you knew that Ronald Biggs was a criminal when you married him.
When I married him, yes, not when I first met him.
Your marriage had a sort of Barbara Cartland quality about it, really. It was the young schoolmaster's daughter being swept off her feet by the highwayman.
Perhaps. When you say I knew he was a criminal, I knew that he had been. I hoped and assumed that he wasn't going to be any more.
You thought traditionally that you could reform him, did you?
Yes, that's what I had in mind. I think he would have been very pleased to hear it. But I sort of felt that he'd had a pretty rough trot in his early life, and that perhaps with a family and people to love him, he wouldn't feel the need to go upsetting, society's codes by taking things that didn't belong to him.
Now, how did he get involved in the great train robbery? Because he'd been going more or less straight, hadn't he, just before that?
Well, we'd lived from 1960 to 63 in a sort of fairly normal working class setup. He had a small jobbing building business in Red Hill, and just so happens that the house that we rented belonged to an ex-police sergeant who died, and we as sitting tenants were in a position to buy it, but we didn't have the deposit. It was tied up in the business, and so we looked around. Couldn't ask my father because he wouldn't have a bar of it, and sort of the people who might be able to. We could raise a couple of £100 or something. We needed 4. It's incredible. It seems such a small amount these days, and the only person that Ron could think of was his friend Bruce Reynolds, who might be able to come up with the necessary cash. Reynolds told him that he didn't really have anything much to spare because it was all tied up in some enterprise that he had going, and that Ron could join him in same if he wished. It was the train robbery.
And that was going to provide a lot more than £200.
Quite, and for somebody with Ron's history was an offer too good to refuse, as they say. And it was planned to take place on August the 8th, 63. The strange thing being that on August Bank Holiday Monday, which was 2 days prior to that, we went to Brighton for the day. Most people, south of England go to the seaside, and he'd backed a couple of horses running Brighton races, and the double had come up, and he actually won £625. 2 days. Well, he was to leave the next morning on the train thing, and we didn't really need it at all then, but by that stage he was too, deeply involved to pull out, and so he went anyway.
So, in quiet Buckinghamshire countryside, the gang of 17 men rigged the signals to stop the Glasgow-London mail train. Driver Mills was coshed, but there was no other violence. They got away with £2.5 million in used notes. Big share was £118,000.
The day after, or the day that Ron had left actually to go to participate in the train robbery, his brother died. He was only about 48, quite young really, had a heart attack after gardening on a Sunday afternoon. And the family got in touch with me because the funeral was to be on the Thursday. And Ron, in fact, wasn't expected home by me until the Friday or Saturday, so I, not knowing where he was or what he was up to, or I thought I knew, contacted the local police and asked them to locate him to bring him home sooner. Needless to say, they couldn't find him in Wiltshire, where I'd said he was, but they remembered later on during the case that he had not been at home at the time.
So it cleared you at any rate?
Well, it sort of proved that I knew nothing about it. I remember sitting behind somebody in court, one of the other relatives, who didn't know who I was, who said, "And who was that silly bitch who found the law up?"
So there you were sitting at home, and you saw the great train robbery on the television news.
No, it wasn't on the news. It was sort of monstrous headlines in the paper the next morning.
And did it go click,
no,
click, click?
Not really, not even then, except...
That's my Ron, you thought?
No, I didn't think that, because for one thing I didn't think he would let us down in that way by chancing the happiness of two small children and me, and I didn't think he needed to do it. When I did know was on the Friday evening, and he phoned up when he was on his way home. I mean, he sort of said, "Guess where I've been?" Oh no. And he didn't say much more. He didn't say on the telephone where he'd been, but I knew. He said, "I've got an old friend with me with glasses on," and I knew who he meant. And you know, within an hour they arrived and pulled all the evil-smelling loot all over the place.
He came in with a mass of fivers, dumped them on the carpet.
Not exactly. It was in cases and kit bag, but it does smell peculiar. Nice sums of money, yes, very sort of a fusty sort of a smell, which you don't ever forget.
Now he was triumphant and elated, presumably. What were you?
Terrified. Terrified. I remember that night when we eventually went to bed, my heart pounded to the extent that I felt it was going through the carpet on the floor. I didn't sleep at all. I had to sort of pretend to him somehow that I wasn't that horrified, but I was. Cold sweat stuff, you know, really.
What did you think you ought to do? I mean, it would seem to the layman that, well, you've got all this money, you ought to have gone straight to London Airport and gone on a plane to Mexico or somewhere.
Oh, no, the place was crawling with police, wasn't it? There was never such a hullabaloo in years as after the train robbery. Everybody that handled a fiver sort of did so with rubber gloves on and terrified that someone would think they'd been part of it. And they were watching all airports and all that sort of. No, his plan, in fact, was to sit on it all for years and gradually row it into his building business.
Didn't he go out and buy you a celebratory present?
Yes, I still have two of the items. One was a coffee percolator, which we didn't have, and a very good German carving set, and, you know, knife and fork and thing. He bought a set of red Swedish glassware with a decanter, and about 3 or 4 Charlie Bird records, which he liked at the time, which I still have.
They're very practical presents. No diamond bracelets.
Oh no, that wasn't
Nothing
in keeping
flash.
with the way we lived. No.
So he was caught, and all your worst convictions
Fears came true. Yes.
Yes. Did you expect then that he'd get a heavy sentence?
No, they'd spoken about it amongst themselves, and they had thought that they would get 15 years because that was about the going rate for that sort of thing at the time. They were all flabbergasted because it was, like he said several times himself, since the equivalent of 3 murder sentences, because people at that time were getting 15 years for murder and getting out after 9 for good behaviour, and to get 30 years because it was 55, so 30 with to be served. It was really out of all proportion.
Were you in court?
Yes.
How did you take the sentence?
Once again, absolutely stunned, couldn't cry, couldn't talk, couldn't do anything for hours and hours. Had that strange feeling that you get under extreme stress of being something on the ceiling, watching it happen down below. Not really believing what your ears had heard, sort of thing.
How did he take it?
He smiled and said, "Thank you, my lord." Oh, he was shattered, but he said to me, "Don't worry about it. I won't be staying here. I'm not a permanent resident. I shall spend every minute of every day planning to remove myself from Her Majesty's holiday camp," which he did.
Big's holiday camp was Wandsworth, where he made, of all things, mailbags. 16 months after sentence, he went over the wall, onto the roof of that furniture van and away. The escape cost him £10,000. He was hidden in flats in Dulwich and Bermondsey, and finally in a house in Bognor Regis.
I was in Whipsnade Zoo when I heard the news. Driving, you can take your car in, and I mean, I'd gone there on purpose to prove that I was miles away at the time, and sort of delighted, frightened, hoping and hoping. I remember going to somebody and them saying to me, "It's 9 hours now. When it's 9 weeks, we can breathe again." And then I remember seeing them sometime afterwards and they said, "When it's 9 months, we can breathe even more easily." And that's how it went, sort of from day to day to day. And the more the days go on, the better you feel about it. There were quite a few heart-stopping moments even then, when they were close behind him. But once he'd left the country, it was better, once he'd got to France.
And then he had cosmetic surgery, plastic surgery, to change his appearance.
Yes, 2 lots. First of all, he had his nose changed because he had a very strong sort of hooked nose, which was fairly noticeable. And he had that sort of bashed with a hammer and turned into a retrousse sort of a job, which changed his appearance remarkably anyway, because it weakened his whole face, I thought. And then he had a facelift, which, involves great big cuts down here and across here, which means that now he has to shave behind his ears. And it did take years off his age, and I think he's still glad he had it done now, because look what it's done for him in Brazil. I mean, he still looks good now. He gets a good tan. He's quite a good physique anyway, so... except when he forgets to hold it in, I've got a good home movie of him not on guard with a great big stomach hanging out over his face. I'll show it to him one day.
But it was a rather painful operation, I guess.
Very. He said at the time that he thought seriously of committing suicide by jumping out the window of the clinic. It was agonising. He had felt as if it was bursting from inside, hundreds and hundreds of stitches.
This was all part of the organisation that got him out of jail. They found him.
Well, it wasn't really an organisation, self-styled organisation, just a couple of guys who happened to be rather good at that sort of thing. No really big wheel deal organisation.
But they provided the fake passports and the safe houses.
Yes, but once again, that wasn't... It sounded grandiose at the time. You swallowed it and you paid up your money happily, but all they did was talk to one of their mates and said, "Are you willing to sell your passport?" It wasn't any sort of foolproof thing. And there was some sort of convention on in Darwin at the time. There were only a few hotels and there was nowhere to go. Absolutely nowhere. There was not a room to be had in the place. And it's not a very large place anyway. And I had to spend the night in the ladies in the airport lounge on a camp bed with the 2 small children. And I had no address. And he wasn't to be seen. And nobody to contact in the whole of Australia. I had money.
All the money?
But no, just a few £1,000, but didn't know where to go or who to contact. I'd been writing to him at a motel in Glenelg in South Australia, but I knew that he wasn't there anymore. And the reception rang and said, "There's a man here to see you." And immediately the heart went boom. And I thought, oh, they've discovered who I am, that I came on false papers or whatever. And I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. And knowing that I couldn't sort of get out of the room or anything, I sort of opened the door, prepared for the worst. And it was Ron, looking all tanned and lovely, and we just sort of fell all over each other, and the kids hanging on either side saying, look at me, Daddy, I'm here too. That was tremendous, and we just sort of cried all over each other for about 5 minutes, you know, with joy and relief and disbelief and, oh, incredible. Happy, happy, happy. One of those moments that makes all the bad bits sort of fade out of view.
You must have felt quite exhilarated at times. I mean,
yes,
it's
this is it. There are the big highs and the lows, but it's never boring.
It's cops and robbers, isn't it? It's like a television drama. It must have been exciting for you.
Yes, I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't exciting at times, to always have that secret knowledge that you're not what you appear to be and all that sort of thing.
And there's a certain satisfaction in getting away with it, in putting one over old Bill, isn't there?
While you're winning, yes, not when you're losing. When they've got you locked up, you don't feel so jolly about it.
Yeah. But, I mean, you're a particularly vivacious and outgoing lady. Being secretive and furtive couldn't have been natural.
No, you don't have to be secretive and furtive. You just go on being yourself. You don't lie, you just miss bits out. It's best not to tell lies because you come unstuck. You just omit the vital details, and you'd be surprised how few they are, really. There were some bad moments when Reynolds was arrested in England and his wife wrote her memoirs, and of all the other robbers who were still in custody, she chose to allow Ron's photograph to be published. And somebody that we knew recognised him because he'd grown to look more like himself. We'd already left Adelaide, but there were people there who knew who we were, the other guy that escaped with him, Flower. And, I mean, the police were knocking on doors asking questions, and we thought then, I mean, they got in touch with us here and said, you know, it's on. And we panicked for a few days, or we didn't do anything, but, you know, every minute you wonder what's going to happen. It was on the television news on 6 o'clock, but it didn't give the names. We waited all night until the papers came out the next morning at 5, and we drove up to the shop and got them, and there were the names, because I'd said, you know, once it gives our Christian names, we're gone. And he said, what am I going to do? I'll stay, I'll let them take me, because it'll be easier for you and the kids. And I'll do it, I'll get it over with, I'll still be young when I come out. And I said, no, you won't. You know, don't give up now. You know, it's a big place, you've got plenty of chance of getting away with it. We'll manage, I'll cope. You go. And he didn't really want to go, but I sort of put it to him that he owed it to us. He owed it to the children to go and have another shot. He hadn't got this far to give up as easily as that.
So Biggs took his wife's advice and went on the run again, while she was arrested and held in Melbourne's Watch House prison. The second time since her marriage, she'd seen the inside of a jail. Once again, the whole Biggs family was pursued, and across Australia, police were urged to think Biggs, but they could only find his children.
He got out of the country eventually on a cruise ship.
Yes, on the LNS, a boat going home to England. What the Australians term a beautiful sight. A boatload of Poms going back to England.
And he sailed to South America?
Yes, to Panama, and he went to Venezuela, and eventually flew down to Rio.
4 years later, Charmian followed him to Brazil.
You're not definitely going to be able to see him.
She swept like a film star through a harrow of press and television, for she was big news once again. Biggs had been discovered on Copacabana, and Scotland Yard detectives were trying to extradite him. The Brazilian authorities resisted and transferred him to a prison in Brasilia, where after 4 years apart, Charmian met her husband once again.
Physically, he was the same person. Mentally, no. He was frightened, under tremendous pressure because his situation was so tenuous, you know. He didn't know whether he was going to be allowed to stay or not, and it all hung on Raimunda producing the baby. She was forever saying she wasn't going to, and this minute she was, and this minute she wasn't.
Raimundo is a dominant other woman, so at a press conference, Biggs talks of divorce.
We are discussing divorce.
You are?
Yes. If I go back to England, I go back to 28 years imprisonment. So there's very little point in trying to make a life together. And perhaps I could continue that life if I could obtain Brazilian citizenship. I have a great amount of affection for Raimunda, but there is nobody would ever replace Charmian, and my children will always be part of my life, and so will Charmian.
I'm tempted to ask you, if I may, that the whole thing seems to now to be a terrible mess for you. This whole 8-year episode. Is that true?
That's putting it mildly. A terrible mess.
He loved his children so much. He wanted them to have things that he'd never had and have chances that he would never be able to give them any other way. I can understand why he did it. He did it with the very best motives. So other people can turn around and say it was foolish, but lots and lots of people given the same opportunity would have done exactly the same as he did.
But it's been 8 years of hell for you, presumably.
Of course. It was worth it. I love him.
I remember, the papers were full of you, and even then it was an extraordinary situation. Here was the emotional tug of war, and who was going to win? Well, it appeared that you lost.
Well, yes, I did. Well, in the long run, perhaps I didn't, but you see, I didn't think there was any struggle. Otherwise, I would never have gone and exposed myself to that sort of trauma.
You thought you were a natural-born winner then, did you?
With him, yes, because he'd written to me constantly all the time that he was there, sent messages with people and all that sort of thing. I had no reason to think otherwise. And he had assured me, he asked me to come, he begged me on the telephone. I spoke to him every night for a week. And eventually, I'd agreed to go, and I'd said to him I wouldn't take the children unless it was a normal family setup. But what he wouldn't admit to me, that he wasn't in command of the situation, and ultimately that's what happened. He couldn't dictate to Raimunda what she would do and what she wouldn't do, because she held the whip hand. She was the one who was pregnant with his child, upon which his future depended, and she said, "You're not going to see your wife, you're going to stay here with me." And that's how it was. And it was very tense and awful, ghastly. And I was absolutely shattered because I had no idea. I was grieved for the children as well as for myself, and we really got to the stage where we couldn't say two pleasant words to each other. So, I went away and decided to let it sort itself out.
But it didn't. It got worse. Back in Melbourne, she was fired from her job because of the publicity. Then, driving the car Biggs had bought, the car she still drives, she was in a fearful smash, and their eldest boy, 10-year-old Nicholas, was killed. Charmian entered Melbourne University to get her BA honours degree. Now she studies for an MA and works as a book publisher's editor.
It wasn't until after Nicholas was killed that friends suggested that I reassess my life and do the things that I had regretted not having done, that I decided to try and get into university and get a degree, because not for the sake of having the piece of paper, but because I really wanted to pursue it. And they were good enough to let me in. And I've enjoyed every minute that I've been here.
How do you think you would be treated if you went back to Reigate?
I don't know, it's hard to say. I haven't been back to England for any length of time for 8 years. From what I've read in the English press of their attitude towards him last year and the attitude of the other train robbers towards him, I don't think the reception would be very favourable. And I think it would always be held against us that we were his family, whereas here you're accepted for what you are and what you can do yourself, and you're not penalised for your family or whatever, as long as you appear to be a good Joe and act as a good Joe for the people that you work with, then you're okay.
So anyhow, you chose a solitary and secure life here in Melbourne rather than staying in a sort of Brazilian limbo.
Well, I wouldn't. I don't think have improved Ron's chances of being allowed to stay by being there, and he certainly didn't want me to be there at that time. Not until the baby was born and everything. And I'm not solitary here. I have the children here, and it's best for them. And so I'm not alone.
It cost you 40, 50, 60,000 pounds to get him out of Wandsworth and out to Australia?
Yes, I suppose so. Or you could say that by the time he arrived here in Australia, all but about £5,000 worth of the money had completely gone. So virtually he never had the joy of spending any of it.
And what's he living on now?
You might well ask. Thin air, I imagine. He's not allowed to work. He's in rather sad circumstances from what I can gather. His nerves aren't in too good a state. He lives on the goodwill of friends. For somebody who always voluntarily worked and never sort of was happy lying around doing nothing, it must be very frustrating. Rio must be in some ways as much a prison as England would be.
It's hard to think of Copacabana as a jail, but I suppose in a way, if you can't move and you can't work, it's a sunny jail.
More bearable, yes, but any restriction upon one's liberty, especially if you're of the type that Ron is some form of a prison, you know.
In retrospect, it might have been better if he'd settled back and done his 10 or 15 years.
When I was there, I thought so, but his view was that it was all very well for everybody else to give him advice. They weren't the ones sitting in Wandsworth or Parkhurst or wherever, and it was his life to make his decision. And he chose to stay in Rio and to take his chances.
Do you think one day you may hear a knock on the door and...
No, I doubt it. I mean, he would be certain to be arrested and sent back to die in prison if he came to Australia, wouldn't he?
And your son Christopher, is he a chip off the old block?
Yes, he looks just like his father. Physically, he's even got some of his ways. He answers back. He's a bit stubborn. But he's fun. He's got a good sense of humour. He's got his father's sense of humour. He's quite a witty boy. And
just don't let him near the Melbourne Railway this time.
No, they're good boys. I think their father would be proud of them anyway.
Are you still going on with the divorce?
Yes, I think so. It's hard to say. As I say, I have no plans to marry anybody else. I don't know what his plans for the future are at all. He says he has no plans because he cannot make plans because he's still under a deportation order from Brazil. Doesn't mean to say that I stopped loving him. It's only writing on a piece of paper, isn't it?
And have you heard from him in these past 2 years?
Yes, he's written to me several times. It was our wedding anniversary last week. He sent me a telegram.
Saying?
Happy anniversary, darling. Glad you're still my wife. Love you all.
Farewell to old England forever. Farewell to me rumcoals as well. Farewell to the well-known Old Bailey, where I once used to cause such a smell. Sing it to a liar, dee. Sing it to a liar, Sing it to a liar, dee. We're bound for Martinique. That's right, you darling. Here's the captain, he is our commander. There's a bosun and all the ship's crew. What you notice? There's a first and a second class passengers. Knows what we've all got mixed been through. Sing it to a liar,